going to have the opportunity to listen to our final keynote, Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost. She is a theologian, a university professor, a writer, and the mother of 5 children. Her recent book, Maternal Body, that I know many copies were being made available to you, is really a must-read. And I'll tell you why I enjoyed the book so much. She not only highlights the evolving theology of motherhood in the book, but she also integrates and discusses, analyzes, offers commentary on the hymns of the church relating to motherhood, also has an excellent section on icons, and the one icon of the Visitation in particular that was just beautifully elaborated upon and discussed in her book, and also the hymns and the icons of the church. But she also has a gracious way of gently but firmly challenging the church about the things that we don't do well regarding motherhood, and the fact that the theology of motherhood is dynamic and evolving, and there are things that we need to continue to develop and consider within the life of the church. So I encourage you to read the book together with her many other writings, and we're thrilled to have her here this morning. Dr. Frost.
Good morning and greetings, fathers, brothers, and sisters in Christ. Thank you for having me here this morning. I'm really honored to be here. I've really enjoyed the past day with you. Thank you. So I would like to tell a story as I begin my talk. First, I would like to fidget with these wires until I'm happy with their location. Okay. When my husband, Matt, and I were married, our friends and relations gamely drove out into the coal country of West Virginia to my hometown Carpatho-Russian Orthodox parish. This was the same little church in which my parents had been married, and also my father's parents. Now, many of our college friends in particular did not have the anchor of a religious background, or at least it had been some time since they had set foot in a place of worship. And so we had done our best to prepare them for an Orthodox wedding. We had told them about the incense, the standing, the lengthy service, and we had held out the promise of an open bar at the reception. At that reception, one of my new husband's friends came over to us. He congratulated us, and then laughing, he said to me, "I just witnessed a fertility rite." Indeed, several of our friends noticed and commented with relish on the many references to children in our marriage service. And they are right in some sense. There are many prayers regarding children in our marriage service. Depending on which translation, there's nearly a dozen references to children when the betrothal and crowning services are taken together. The general theme of these prayers is that may the couple who is being married be blessed with children, something like that. And I've chosen a line from these prayers, from the litany that before the crowning, for the title of my talk. The full line is that he will make them glad with the sight of sons and daughters. Let us pray to the Lord. And I will return to the particular significance of this line later in my talk. But contrary to my college friends' giddy and slightly scandalized reactions to the many references to children, our Orthodox marriage service is not really a fertility rite. It is, as we know, a sacrament. It is the only sacrament bonding 2 persons together. It is the sacrament of love. And the prayers for children are contextualized within this sacramental understanding of the union of the 2 persons within marriage. This contextualization of children, this theological understanding of children within marriage, is what I am here to talk about today. I will elucidate several foundational principles in our theological understanding of children within marriage, and I will discuss how these principles, these theological touchstones, shape our understanding of marriage and children, and offer us discernment around matters pastoral and ethical of marriage and children. As I said a moment ago, marriage is different from all the other sacraments. It is the sacrament of love. It is the only sacrament that involves two persons freely and equally bound together, bound to one another by God. My friend, Archdeacon John Krasovkis, writes this, quote, "Marriage is, according to the Orthodox view, a sacrament, because through it God directly reveals the heavenly kingdom to the world and to specific persons," end quote. Mystically, man and woman, husband and wife become one, as the rite of matrimony says. Here's a quote from the rite. Yoke them in oneness of mind, crown them into one flesh. Notice that both mind and body are being yoked together here. Both our minds and our bodies are being joined, the whole person as being joined together with the other whole person. Now, the church did not invent marriage, nor does it have a monopoly on marriage. But the church took the institution of marriage, which previously had been understood as a relationship largely in proprietary or legal terms, concerned principally with family lineage and economy, and transfigured it into a sacramental bond between persons that mystically signifies the love of Christ for his church. I feel when I'm talking about marriage that I would be remiss if I did not mention the fact that there have been many times in Christian history when consecrated virginity or monasticism have been held up as higher or more noble Christian paths over married life. And that is true, and that has had an effect on the way we perceive and think about marriage. However, this makes the church's understanding of marriage as a sacrament all the more remarkable. I will also note that the church has condemned hostility to marriage. And as Metropolitan Kallistos Ware has pointed out in a recent essay, that, quote, "the marriage service has been used on millions of occasions, and so it carries far greater weight than the opinions of individual thinkers." Also, today, the church is more deeply considering married and family life than ever before, as witnessed by this conference, and more lay theologians and women are contributing to the body of thought about marriage, which is an important development. Keeping all this in mind, we fundamentally understand marriage as a sacramental union, a shared path to deification, and a full union of body and soul. Here are the words of Orthodox theologian Vigen Guroian, who happened to be my PhD advisor and is a mentor and friend. He wrote, "Husband and wife are joined together as one in holy matrimony. They are an ecclesial entity, one flesh, one body, and corporate of two persons, who in freedom and sexual love and through their relationship to Christ image the triune life of the Godhead and express the great mystery of salvation and Christ's relationship to the church." Again, from Guroian's words, we hear about the body, about how these two persons are united, not just in some abstract spiritual sense, but in a bodily sense, sexual and more. Note that I have not yet mentioned parenthood, procreation, or children at all. This is because procreation and children are not definitive to our understanding of marriage. Instead, the mystical and unitive bond between two persons created by the sacrament of marriage defines marriage. And it is within this context, within the context of the unitive bond of the couple, that we understand children. Children can be a part of the unitive quality of marriage, but they do not define it. They are not a necessary ingredient to the success or the sacramental validity of a marriage. Instead, again, using the words of Vigen Guroian, children are a gift and a blessing, a human reflection within the union of husband and wife of the power and the plenitude of the divine nature. It is in this context that we hear the prayers for children in the marriage service. We hear these multiple petitions for the blessing of children within marriage. Here are a few of the ones that we hear. May your children be like young olive plants around your table. Grant your servants name a peaceful life, length of days, chastity, love for one another in a bond of peace, offspring long-lived, fair fame by reason of their children, and a crown of glory that does not fade away. Account them worthy to see their children's children. Though we have just worked through the theological understanding of marriage and established that children do not define a marriage, we do, as we have also established, mention children many times in the marriage service. What does this mean? Let me return to the line from which I took the title of my talk, that he will make them glad with the sight of sons and daughters. Let us pray to the Lord. I'm going to unpack this line. First of all, encapsulated in this line is a bit of theological anthropology, a reminder of how we fundamentally understand what it means to be human. When we encounter a new human that has come into the world, we are to be glad at the sight of him or her, as it says in this line. Humans are the pinnacle of God's creation, created in his own image and likeness, created to grow in communion with him, called to eternity with him. Each person is unique, irreplaceable, eternal. Each time a new human comes into the world, an event of cosmic proportions takes place, and awe, thanksgiving, and as it says here, gladness are the proper reactions. Now, I am not telling you anything that you don't know, but I am highlighting this because I believe it is so important in our understanding of children within marriage. Thinking a little bit more about this line, that he will make them glad with the sight of sons and daughters, let us pray to the Lord, I find the first part of it interesting, that he will make them glad. Because I hear a sort of subtle acknowledgement that perhaps mothers and fathers do not always immediately respond with gladness to the news of a pregnancy. Even in a good and loving marriage, unplanned and stressful pregnancies occur. And this prayer asks for help in encountering those situations with the proper joy. And we hear and we know that the Lord will make us glad. He will help us to have the proper gladness and joy if we are struggling to have that reaction. Another aspect we see at work in this petition from the marriage service is the broadly held expectation within the Orthodox Church that marriages will be, at least at some point in their history, open to children. We repeatedly pray for the blessing of children in the marriage service. We repeatedly illumine this ideal vision of children joining the marriage, as my college friends so clearly picked up on. We even pray for grandchildren, as it says in the prayer, that they may live to see their children's children. If children do not define marriage, why is this the case? Why do we understand our marriages as ideally open to children? It is because childbearing is a godly act, a time when we participate in the act of creation, of bringing another unique, precious human person into the world. I've already talked about how highly we value the one precious life of a human person. Then, within marriage, through the procreative process, we have the possibility of imitating and participating in God's creative powers through procreation. Though the sacrament of marriage is not defined by procreation, it has unique creative capacities that ought not be squandered or ignored. Human life is good and meant to be generated and shared. Our caregiving powers are also creative and profound, and they may be exercised by welcoming non-biological children into a marriage. Sometimes adoption is presented as an afterthought, as a last-ditch option after a couple is not able to conceive. But really, I am deliberately presenting it here as its own parental vocation alongside biological parenthood, its own inspired act of marital hospitality. And let me say that when I say I am presenting it, I am doing this as a constructive theologian. This is not always the way you will hear this presented when you read Orthodox statements on this matter or Orthodox bioethics manuals. This is a contribution that I am boldly presenting here myself as a theologian. Whether biological or adoptive, the ideal is that children are part of married life. Though they don't define marriage, they are a natural reflection of the plenitude of the divine nature. So they belong naturally within a marriage. This is an ideal, and we live in a less than ideal world. You may have noticed. We also live in an era with medical advances and opportunities that affect our reproductive lives. Fortunately, as we encounter this world, we have a set of normative principles about marriage and children that I've just elucidated, that I've just gone through, and these will aid us in discernment in matters involving parenthood and marriage. And let me just briefly review those. Marriage is a sacrament defined by the union of two persons, the whole person's body, soul, mind, all of the person. Children are a blessing within that sacrament. They are a natural reflection of God's creativity, but they do not define the marriage. The creation of a human person is innately good, is always a source of gladness and rejoicing, and the Lord will help us rejoice. And marriages are ideally expected to be open to children. The procreative process is godly and good. In a moment, I'm going to begin discussing some pastoral situations involving parenthood and marriage with the use of these normative foundations or principles, these touchstones for discernment in particular situations. And I use the word discernment very thoughtfully here because I understand that in the church we do not have dogmatic statements on every little situation that we encounter. This is not the way we function as a church. Instead, we have these normative principles with which we prayerfully discern. And when we do this sort of discernment in this way, based on these principles, and in this prayerful fashion, we open ourselves up to the possibility of these kairos moments that are one of the themes of this conference. And one more word about discernment before I move on. Often when I am reading pastoral advice or even bioethical sort of statements about these sort of situations having to do with reproductive technology or contraception or things of this like, I hear statements like, the couple needs to have prayerful discernment along with their spiritual father. That is often a sort of statement that comes together. This is not enough, and I brought this up in our question session yesterday. Married couples need other resources. They need non-monastic resources if they have a monastic spiritual father. Married couples need married couple resources. Wives need women as resources to help with their discernment. We as a church need to figure out ways to unburden our priests and not expect them to be all things to all people. And in general, need to better connect our laity and allow them to be better support and resources to each other and allow those connections to build up the body of Christ. And to this point, I want to take a moment and honor the organizers of this conference, who included 4 married couples and several women in their program. What a beautiful and well-designed offering that ministers to how people actually live their married lives, and allowed these connections to form. So thank you for that. I will move on now to issues that warrant discernment and discuss how these normative principles that I've talked about so far regarding children within marriage might aid us in encountering these issues. What I will do here is I will characterize how the Orthodox Church, through its synods, its theologians, its ethicists, has begun to encounter these issues, and I will offer my own reflection in a few places. I also want to share with you some news, which is that in 2017, His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch, appointed a special commission of theologians to prepare a formal document on the social thinking of the Church, as it has been reflected and expressed in tradition throughout the centuries, and as the Ecumenical Patriarch has done so in contemporary practice. He was inspired to do this by the Holy and Great Council in Crete in 2016, and with his blessing, this document will be released very soon. It will be released during Great Lent of this year. It's being translated right now into 12 different languages in preparation for its release. And it does include reflection on these issues that I am about to discuss. I am on this commission, and I was given a blessing to tell you about this forthcoming document. I'm not at liberty to quote from it, but I'm at liberty to share that it is coming, so that you may anticipate its release. And I pray read it when it appears. It is called For the Life of the World Toward a Social Ethos of the Orthodox Church. So, coming soon. So, moving on. What does the expectation of openness to children within marriage mean when we live in an era of readily available contraceptive products for most of the Orthodox Christian world? So yes, we live in this era of readily available contraceptive products, but first of all, let's just be clear that methods of contraception have been around from time immemorial, and we have examples of the Church Fathers reacting negatively to those methods because, for the most part, and due to the way the biological act of contraception was understood in the ancient world, all those methods were understood to be abortive. They were understood to abort an early pregnancy. Today, however, we have, first of all, a more sophisticated understanding of the biological reproductive process, and the contraceptive methods available to us are of many different kinds. In this context, the Orthodox Church does not have a universal dogmatic position on contraceptives, but the Church has begun to discern how we ought to encounter contraception today. Generally speaking, I would say that the trend is towards the Church condoning the judicious, prayerful, provisional, and exceptional use of safe, non-abortive contraceptive methods. Let me give some examples. In 1992, the Orthodox Church in America Synod released this statement that was part of a larger document of affirmations on marriage, family, sexuality, and the sanctity of life. Here's the quote. Married couples may express their love and sexual union without always intending the conception of a child, but only those means of controlling conception within marriage are acceptable, which do not harm a fetus already conceived. That's from the Orthodox Church in America statement. So in this statement, if we think about it, we hear some of these normative principles of marriage that I have outlined. We hear the appreciation for the sacramental union of the couple, and an appreciation for the unitive quality of marriage, and the affirmation that the marital sexual union is not exclusively concerned with procreation. We also hear the normative principle that human life is innately good, and in the rejection of the forms of contraception that would harm or abort a fetus. Those are not tolerated at all. And then the OCA Synod has therefore accepted the use of contraception that is non-abortive within these parameters. So that's what we hear from the Orthodox Church in America. Similar statements are made on the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese website, but they are not from a synod. They are statements made by Orthodox theologians and ethicists in articles that are posted on the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese website, presumably given some sort of imprimatur from the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese by their appearance there. The Russian Orthodox Church and Synod released a really thorough social doctrine document in 2000 on all sorts of issues, and in it they clearly distinguish between non-abortive and abortive contraception methods and affirm the couple's discernment and give them space for discernment when it comes to non-abortive contraception. Yes. So, and here's I would say a sort of representative pastoral sort of statement in relationship to the openness to children within marriage, coming from Abbot Trifon in Washington State on his blog, his morning blog that he writes. He writes, "Birth control should never be based on selfish motives or the desire to live a more comfortable lifestyle. This life is not meant for personal gratification nor personal gain, but that we might give glory and worship to God in all we do." Thinking further about our normative principles around marriage when we consider contraception, when we know that marriages are expected to be open to childbearing at some point, this helps us to see contraception as provisional and exceptional. And I see that this might help us overcome one of the biggest psychological and spiritual pitfalls of contraception, which is the false sense of control over one's fertility, this false sense of control over one's body that contraception and the modern messaging around it creates and promotes. That's my observation. And also, our openness to children means we will welcome them when contraception fails, as it sometimes does. Before I move to other matters, I want to acknowledge that while it is my observation that the Church is trending towards this sort of provisional use of non-abortive contraceptives within marriage that will be open to children at some point in their history, and that this is compatible with these normative principles of marriage, it is still the case that different couples will discern and understand their call to childbearing differently. The idea of marriages being open to children at some point in their history will have a range of interpretations. And because of our understanding of children within marriage and our lack of dogma on these topics, we have room for different expressions of childbearing in our church. The saints show us every day that there are many different ways to live a good and holy Christian life. And this is certainly true in Christian marriages and families as well. For marriages that are not able, for whatever reasons, to include children, we can swiftly conclude from what we know about Orthodox marriage as a sacrament that these marriages are in no way diminished. Their sacramental unions are intact. St. John Chrysostom of the 4th century wrote, quote, "But suppose there is no child. Do they," meaning the married couple, "remain two and not one? No, their intercourse affects the joining of their bodies, and they are made one, just as when perfume is mixed with ointment." Here he is speaking quite directly and openly about the one flesh union as undiminished by the lack of procreative output. But I think there is also a metaphorical and spiritual context to what he is saying. Their sacramental union is intact in body and spirit. Even though the ideal is that Orthodox marriages are at some point open to children, this ideal is not possible for some couples. Some couples begin their marriage with this knowledge. In Orthodox writings on the subject, this is often expressed as an acknowledgement that there may be physical health problems that preclude childbearing. But should we not also extend this acknowledgement to psychological and spiritual health as well? In some cases, these impediments may prevent any sort of openness to children, biological adoption, or fostering. Some marriages will, in fact, be closed to childbearing from the start. Again, though, the sacramental quality of the union is unchanged, and these couples need to hear this. Other couples may desire to have biological children, but may not be able to. They may face the challenge of what we call infertility. In our pastoral encounters with couples who are dealing with infertility, we need to remind them of this sacramental understanding of marriage and assure them that their sacramental bond is unchanged, it is sound. As my fellow conference presenter, Dr. Nicole Rokas, notes in her book, Under the Laurel Tree, Grieving Infertility with Saints Joachim and Anna, the emotional aspects, including the grief of infertility, need proper pastoral attention. She writes, as with so many other wounds in life, we can only decide what to do about infertility once we have begun to grieve well. As to to decide what to do about infertility, here is a place, as with contraception, the Orthodox Church has no dogma about these particular technologies. So I will return to our normative principles of marriage. One of our principles is that the creation of a human person is innately good. This goodness of human life, this inalienable dignity and incomparable value of each human person is the necessary touchstone for assessing whether any reproductive technology is licit. We must therefore ask of any reproductive technology if it is violating human life and its efforts to help conceive human life. Because the Church has always understood personhood and conception as deeply bound up with each other, we celebrate the Annunciation and the conception of righteous Anna as the ultimate beginnings of Jesus and his mother, respectively. The Orthodox thinking on this matter is that a reproductive technology that compromises or snuffs out a human life, no matter how early in the process of development, is contradictory to our respect for the inherent goodness for each human life. Another touchstone for assessing any reproductive technology is the consideration of whether that method honors the sacramental relationship between the two spouses. I have emphasized how bound the spouses' bodies are to each other in the sacramental relationship. And this can and should bear on any decisions made about fertility technologies. We must therefore ask of any reproductive technology if it is violating or interfering with the relationship between the spouses. To some degree, some may discern this answer differently than others. But clearly the relationship between the spouses is violated by the introduction of any material from a different person, third-party material. And this understanding appears to be broadly held by Orthodox sources. A very difficult cross for couples to bear is the loss of life in utero through miscarriage or also the experience of a stillbirth. The couple needs the permission and space to properly grieve this unique loss. And here is the place where I would put the role of and the need for discernment largely in the institutional church's hands today. Specifically, I would ask, will the church finally discern that the prayers for miscarriage in the Evlogion, in the Book of Needs, are not just inadequate but inappropriate and spiritually harmful? I'll read us just one line in case we've forgotten the harshness of these prayers. Though I will note that this language is softened in some of the Greek to English translations. It's, as far as I can tell, never softened in the Slavic translations of my background. But in the Greek to English, here is a line. Have mercy on this thy handmaid, who today is in sin, having fallen into the killing of a person, whether voluntary or involuntary, and has cast out that conceived in her. We hear in this line that the mother is sinful due to her miscarriage, and she is considered to have committed an act of murder in her miscarriage. We can learn all we want about the history of the service and different understandings of miscarriage and pregnancy loss in pre-modern times, but nothing in our theology or our sense of Christian compassion can justify saying these words to a woman who has just suffered this loss. We are a church who knows how to honor our dead, that processes our world through ritual, that understands, as much of this talk has been about the precious uniqueness of each human life. And yet we fail those lives and their parents every time we read this prayer, or we do nothing because this prayer is so difficult when a life is miscarried or stillborn. The Orthodox Church in America, its Synod approved a new pastorally compassionate version of these prayers several years ago. The Antiochian Orthodox Church also revised their prayers. Why does not every jurisdiction follow suit? Or the Assembly of Bishops not participate in assisting all the jurisdictions do the same? I've talked about children within marriages and marriages without children, or that have suffered the loss of children. And now I want to go off topic a tiny bit and briefly mention children born outside of marriages. Our ideal, of course, is that all children are born inside of healthy, strong marriages. But as acknowledged several times this morning, we do not live in an ideal world. Children are often born outside the bonds of marriage in America today, even in our communities. And yet, here one of our normative principles still applies. The creation of a human person is innately good and is always a source of gladness and rejoicing, and the Lord will help us rejoice. When a woman today in America has a baby, when she's not married, it is a choice. She nearly always has been asked, if not pressured, to have an abortion. This is true even in our communities. And we as a community can respond with gladness to these new lives, whether they are in our parishes or not. That is a choice that we have. This is a good place for me to conclude. The uncompromising, unapologetic love of our Creator for each child, indeed each human person, and the prayer and the marriage rite that we might reflect and emulate that love by being glad with the sight of sons and daughters in our marriages is the ultimate foundation for understanding children within marriage. As Orthodox Christians, we have foundations rather than formulas or dogma for our encounters with questions of contraception, reproductive technology, and the openness to children within marriage. This allows us to simultaneously hold up ideals while treating with equal dignity and care those who fall short of those ideals. Most of what I have said this morning has to do with the beginnings of parenthood, starting a family or trying to start a family. And yet the fundamental way that we think about human persons that is expressed in that line from the marriage service may serve as our touchstone throughout married and family life, through all its many years and seasons. We are called to be glad with the sight of sons and daughters as parents. Even as those sons and daughters grow and mature and change, we must still rejoice in their presence. Or even if those sons and daughters do not come, and we learn instead, as best we are able, to delight in the sons and daughters of others and to bear other fruit. And in terms of our shared vocation that is rooted in our sacramental bond, our family, whether it includes offspring or not, our family must become a breeding ground for gladness. After all, the calling of married and family life, its highest ideal, is as best possible on earth to create a miniature kingdom, a microcosm of redeemed creation in which we are able to greet everyone with the gladness with which God greets us, his own sons and daughters. Thank you.